Victoria 3 is the brand new grand strategy game out of Paradox Interactive, and it throws us into a fairly complex world. A world actually not too dissimilar from ours, although some 180 years ago. The game starts in 1836, and it is absolutely an economic and political simulation game at its core. Victoria 3 lets us play as any unified state, although it does give us some objectives. There are no hard and fast victory conditions in a game like Victoria 3, and if you've played Paradox's other grand strategy games, this won't be a surprise to you. However, as you can see here, it does give some objectives and recommendations for who you might like to play. However, at the end of the day, this is an open sandbox world, and you can jump in basically any old where. Again, those incorporated established states. There are other territories on the map that are for largely colonizing only at this point. Victoria 3 is a massive simulation, and as such, it may be difficult to run on some older computers. However, I've found it to run actually pretty dang well, all things considered. Of course, the scale of this thing is huge. As I mentioned in the introduction, Victoria 3 is an economic simulator at its heart. It also has a very good political system, both for managing internal politics by passing laws, more on those in a little bit, but also international relations, managed through a system called diplomatic plays, where nations can engage in diplomacy with one another, provided that they're within their sphere of influence or diplomacy. I'll show you a little bit more about that later in this review video as well. Victoria 3 therefore presents the player with a load of different ways that they can approach the game, and to be honest, it can be a little overwhelming. The tabs down the bottom, the lenses, do a good job at placing things into perspective. Here you can see I'm using the trade route one to look where my Spanish market is in relation to others. Try and pull in goods at higher or lower prices in the Spanish market compared to those international markets. This is very much a game about supply and demand, and as you can see me delving in here to the opium supply in the Spanish market, or maybe we move back to the construction sector in England, it's all about either producing goods and services inside of your nation and supplying your populations, or about engaging in international trade. It's about building a market also that you understand. This is very much a living world, and this goes for the economy as well as every other sector of Victoria 3. Here you can see the opium market, where it's being produced and where it's being consumed. The two, of course, are very different. This is but one, and granted a little bit of an unusual good, inside of Victoria 3's fairly lengthy and established system of goods that service populations within your nation. Speaking of which, as you can see here, in typical glorious chart fashion out of Paradox, you get a breakdown of your populations, their culture, their political strength, their employment, and all sorts of other metrics. Now these play out on a load of different scales, but the most important ones to us as players will be the economy, who's working in the buildings, how much are they getting paid, what are we producing overall for our nation and our market, and then secondly, well, it's a little more political. What's their quality of life like? Can they vote? Who and where? Who are they ruled by? In politics in Victoria 3, interest groups are divided. Industrialists, landowners, you name it. All sorts of different groups appear. There are some unique ones depending on who you're playing, maybe a more unique minor nation like Sokoto here. Or maybe you're playing the big guns, Victoria herself up in Great Britain, provided she's still alive and in charge. Because of course, at the end of the day, this sandbox game allows us to take it wherever we like. We're not the only factor in the game though, of course. This is a political simulator where you're going to be dealing with the AI a lot, and I'll draw on discussions on single-player AI interactions a little bit throughout this video as well. But firstly, I want to talk about these interest groups. There are various different ones, and of course they're made up of those populations that we talked about earlier, with jobs and places they live, and needs that must be met. The interest groups, though, are on a different level. They have modifiers that apply to the nation, and each interest group, made up of those pops we talked about earlier, has ideologies. These ideologies give them stances on laws, and if you don't have the right interest groups in power, or forming political parties perhaps, then you just can't pass those laws. They're literally not an option for you. You're given an option to reform a government, of course, depending on what type of government you are. You may have elections, you may have a king or a queen, it's really a mixed bag. But the interest groups within your nation, with their ideologies and some buffs and nerfs as well that can apply to the entire state, can then form a government with legitimacy over its people. A government too low in legitimacy will cause radicals to rise up against you, potentially leading to revolution, one of many causes that could send you down that path. A government with a strong level of legitimacy, a strong mandate, with interest groups that are bolstered with your support, potentially directly using your authority, or throughout a variety of other ways, will literally determine the shape of the laws that are passed. And as you can see here, it literally influences everything from the state level anyway. Things like, should we colonize? Yes, no, maybe. All sorts of economic laws, in fact. Human rights. Should we speak? What should we do with our women and children? Should we have social security? How should we structure the economy? You name it. All of these things play out slowly, of course, over time, and sometimes radically. Because inside of Victoria 3, there's also a war system at play, and this one is honestly probably one of the most controversial elements, at least from the coverage that I've seen before Victoria 3 has come out. And that's probably because warfare and conflict are one part of the diplomatic arsenal. One way in which diplomacy could be used to leverage power over the map, more resources, more territory, or potentially forcing other states to give, concede, or do certain things for you. Anything from give you a treaty port that you can conduct your trade out of, through to changing their laws, banning slavery, for example. Building a military is done using buildings, like a lot of other things in Victoria 3, barracks, etc. Managing it is done using your generals, who are characters, like the political leaders in Victoria 3. They have their own lifespans and certain unique identities. They align to interest groups, and they all give unique bonuses, depending of course on where they're placed. Military commanders may be better at spearheading an offense or defending a front line, while political leaders may bolster things like the economy or bureaucracy over a certain region. In terms of managing conflict, it looks a little bit like this. You can zoom in on individual battles to watch certain things play out, watch the metrics, the numbers go up or down, as it were. Ultimately, it's of course a game based around the kind of equipment that you're providing to your troops, their supply lines and level of infrastructure in a territory. Outside of that, it's largely down to assigning front lines and then choosing whether you want your generals commanding your battalions to attack, defend, or hold. Again, it's the gear that they're using, the positioning and supply, that is more important than the player's ability to click quickly in Victoria 3. And that is really best demonstrated in its diplomatic system. Here we see warfare again not as a mainstay like it might be in a game of Hearts of Iron 4, but instead as one piece of the puzzle, a means to our ends. Of course, there are things like build relationships or destroy them with other nations. You can also engage in other ways, trade being one of the most important ones, and there are loads of intricacies within that, like making sure you have convoys available if you want to trade overseas. Trade routes themselves, of course, like many other things, can level up and upgrade. You can also declare strategic interests around the map, saying, hey, I want to be able to play in that space. Because Victoria 3 is somewhat limited in that respect. You can't just stomp all over the world, you need to be able to justify your interests in the region, and these are generally given out what felt to me like a fairly appropriate level, depending on the size of your state and your overall power in the world. There are other actions, of course, that you can push through warfare as conflict escalates. All diplomatic plays move through a period of escalation where warfare is threatened, allies can be pulled in, maybe there are other countries that have interests in the area. And then it could fall to conflict like we saw earlier, but it can go a number of other ways. I've had many states cede their territory to me before going to war because I was just simply too strong. Other times I've had them pull in surprise allies and alliances, or I've been too weak to build up my own, too feeble or short-sighted to build up strong enough allies to come in just in case I needed them. It's absolutely a political game and a political simulator at its core, and warfare is but one piece of that, and it's important to bear that in mind. Now that we've covered off what Victoria 3 is, how it plays, what it brings to the table, let's get to the real meat of the conversation, and the people who are skipping ahead from the time cards can join us. Is Victoria 3 worth it? I think the answer is probably yes, but there's a big old asterisk on there. Let me describe why. Victoria 3 is, in my opinion, a great strategy game, and I honestly, this is not sponsored whatsoever, although I have put around 50 hours into a press preview build, it's important to bear that in mind. It's a great game. It runs well, it's kept me interested. Not necessarily, of course, because it's guiding me through and giving me core objectives, although the in-game journal does help to structure it a little bit, but because I can build my own stories. However, there are some caveats here. It's a lot to learn. This is a complicated game, and even though people claim it has the UI or it looks or plays like a mobile game, I have to disagree. There's no way this is running on your Oppo Find 3 Lite whatever, just to put that out there. It may be taxing, in fact, on weaker PCs. Also bear that in mind, and check the system requirements against your own if you're unsure. I loved that Victoria 3 is a political sandbox, an economic sandbox, and the warfare system, honestly, more front of mind than what people might have told you. For me, it's fairly prominent. I don't like small things like the notifications overwhelming down the bottom, a little bit of a weakness around UI and accessibility functions. I love the fact that it has some much more modernized UI over its 12-year-old predecessor, the back button on menus, etc. There are some great quality of life improvements here over previous Victoria entries, and it would be hard to recommend them in this day and age. But do bear in mind, this is a somewhat complicated beast, and it will likely need and receive many paid and free updates to come by in the future if any other Paradox or even more broader strategy games are anything to go by. If you're chomping at the bit for historical or even grand strategy and you want a deep simulation, look no further than Victoria 3. Those, of course, willing to wait will likely get a better deal down the line.